So, yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Monodeep Dutt from Earth Day Network India team. Earth Day was first commemorated on April 22nd, 1970 in the US and is today the largest global civic movement that brings together billions of people worldwide for the good of our shared home, Earth. Each year, a theme is announced for Earth Day. The global theme for 2024 is Planet versus Plastics. The theme unites all who inhabit Earth in an unwavering commitment to call for the end of plastics, as these pollute the soil, water, and air, negatively impacting the planet's health and that of all living beings, humans included. Today's discussion will focus on the importance of formulating policies to limit the use of plastics in the agricultural sector. To help focus on the topic, we are honored to have, right now we have two. We hopefully would be joined with our third notable speaker. Earth Network India is grateful to them for sparing their valuable time to be with us. Once we have heard all the speakers, we'll hopefully have a little time for a few questions from the audience. Keep on placing your questions in the Q&A box. Our first speaker for today is Aidan Charron, who is the Director of End Plastic Initiatives at earthday.org. The environment-focused organization grew out of the first Earth Day and today, 53 years later, engages with over 50,000 organizations in some 192 countries on leading environmental concerns. Growing up on the coast of North Carolina in US, Aidan is passionate about issues related to the environment, particularly the concern to keep our planet waste-free. He loves the outdoors and is a keen hiker, surfer, and scuba diver. Before joining earthday.org, Aidan worked to reclaim wetlands. Aidan, could you please tell us a little about the Earth Day 2024 theme and about earthday.org's role in the recent plastic treaty? Your thoughts too, please, on the importance of having policies on plastics in agriculture. Over to you, Aidan.
Yeah, so I'm Aidan Charron, the Director of End Plastic Initiatives at earthday.org. So our main focus for Earth Day 2024 is planet versus plastic. And we're doing that because we're currently living in the Plasticine, an era in which plastics have permeated every aspect of our lives like an epidemic. So microplastics are impossible to avoid. Since the 1950s, when plastics first started appearing in our lives, we've been force-fed the idea that they made our lives better. Plastics are almost good enough to eat, and some adverts were saying that. In 1997, an advert from the American Plastic Council, that is exactly how they touted plastic wrappings and containers. We know that isn't true now. They joked plastics are the sixth food group. They're to keep contamination out of our food, as well as extending their shelf life. We're now only discovering how pertinent that sentiment is as we find microplastics in our water and in the food chain itself. We're indeed almost certainly all eating plastics, whether that's the plastic wrapping, the plastics floating around in our air, or the plastics found in our soil and agriculture. While we'd be pretty sure the copywriter was not laughing at our expense, the real question is, what did the plastic industry actually know back then? As plastic production is set to double by 2040, what do we really know about this non-inert material and its array of additive chemicals? So our focus at Earth Day is to bring to light the main health effects of plastic, as well as the main environmental health effects. So it's beyond an environmental issue. We know that it's not just straws killing sea turtles now. We know that it's affecting all of our health, especially the health of babies and infants, just because of the way they interact with the world in a more tactile function. So they're putting things in their mouths, they're crawling on the ground, and they're just inhaling microplastics at such a greater rate. And those chemicals and additives have been linked to increases of childhood cancer rates. It's being found in the placentas of women all over the world, and it's also being linked to developmental issues, especially in developing countries. So our focus for Earth Day 2024 is to decrease the amount of plastics through reduction efforts, especially when it comes to the plastic treaty. Sorry, I can spend a little bit more. Some of the things we want to see when it comes to the plastics treaty is a plastic production reduction. So we want to see reductions that are legally binding. We also want to see the prioritization of reuse in the plastics industry. We keep hearing the world's circular, and we know that we can't recycle our way out of this problem anymore. We also need to establish transparency standards of chemicals of concern, so chemicals that are used in the production of plastic. We also need to eliminate non-essential plastic products. So we don't need to have these plastic products that were used for 2 minutes at a time. They're spent, they sit in shelves for a year and then we unwrap it and then we throw it away. So our main goals at these INC Plastics Treaty is also to kind of be the communicators for organizations such as CIEL and other law-based organizations and kind of make it more palatable for the general public so they know what's going on. We act as the kind of media contact as well as the press contact and take what is going on in these treaties and just kind of condense it down and just make sure that people are aware that this is going on, that plastic is an issue that is being addressed by the world, and we just want to make sure that everybody's aware of it. That is what I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. That really sets the tone for the webinar. Thank you for really throwing light on the important topics and how plastic has been affecting our lives. So we now move on to our next speaker for the day. Our next speaker is Richard Thompson, who is an independent expert on hazardous chemicals and waste. Following a career in the private sector in environmental services and hazardous waste management, he joined the Pesticides Management Program at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, also known as FAO. Richard has co-authored 2 FAO flagship reports, Global Assessment of Soil Pollution in 2021. I've also placed the links in the chat, as well as the Assessment of Agricultural Plastics and Their Sustainability, a Call for Action, again in 2021. He recently supported FAO in developing the Voluntary Code of Conduct on the sustainable use of plastics in agriculture. Richard, could you please throw some light on the Food and Agriculture Organization's important Voluntary Code of Conduct on sustainable use of plastics in agriculture, and on the potential policy interventions government could adopt to reduce the risk of mismanaged plastic and pollution? Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Greetings, everybody. Thanks for that kind introduction. So I'll be talking about the Voluntary Code of Conduct on the Sustainable Use of Plastics, which is being developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and safeguarding Indian soils, just some examples. So just to talk a little bit about the report that was published. So this FAO published the first global assessments of plastics used in agriculture in 2021. The report identified that every year, 12.5 million tons of plastic products are used in plant and animal production. The crop production and livestock sectors are the largest users, accounting for about 10 million tons per year, followed by fisheries and agriculture with 2 million, and forestry bringing up the rear. The benefits of using plastics in agriculture include increased yields, production efficiency, alongside reduction of food loss and waste. However, their use incurs high environmental, economic, and social costs, primarily from increased pollution. This also impacts food safety, food security, through, amongst other things, the impairment of soils. The report included a call for global action for improved intersectoral collaboration and governance to address plastic use throughout agri-food systems. In December 21, partly a result of this report, the FAO Council endorsed the decisions of an earlier meeting of its Committee on Agriculture, basically encouraging the organization to undertake further scientific and evidence-based assessments related to the distribution, benefits, trade-offs, and risks of plastics for agricultural use and their alternatives, and to address knowledge gaps on plastics in agriculture. And secondly, to develop a voluntary code of conduct on the sustainable use of plastics in agriculture, and finally, to support the deliberations of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee working on the new plastic treaty, with guidance on the issues of plastics used in agriculture. So what is a voluntary code of conduct? Well, it's an international agreement developed in consultation with FAO's member states. So it's similar to the international legally binding instrument. It's very specific to plastics used in agriculture. It sets recommendations for good practice for not only governments, as is the case in the international instrument, but also other stakeholders involved in the life cycle of plastic products used in agriculture, such as product manufacturers, distributors, ancillary equipment manufacturers, users, and end-of-life managers. It's voluntary. That is, it's non-binding on FAO's members to implement all its measures. That makes negotiations easier and potentially allows for a broader scope than possibly could be achieved in the international legally binding instrument, which requires consensus. Codes of conduct support the development of subsidiary guidelines. So FAO has developed a wide range of voluntary codes of conduct that countries have used for developing their national legislation. So these include codes of conduct on managing fertilizers, on food loss and waste reduction, and on pesticide management. Codes of conduct have been cited by many member states as a crucial support to them developing their national legislation. I'm not going to be talking very much about the international legally binding instrument because Aidan's already spoken, and I know that Dharmesh will also be speaking about it. So let me touch on how the code of conduct and the instrument could work together. The zero draft of the international legally binding instrument includes the concept of sectoral approaches. Now, as plastics used in agriculture are very specific, their solutions require specific responses. So the code of conduct could provide the approach for the management or the text of the legally binding instruments related to plastics used in agriculture. The timeline. The voluntary code of conduct has a very similar timeline to the international legally binding instrument. It started out this year with multi-stakeholders meetings, global experts, regional groups, and they've all happened. And now my colleagues or ex-colleagues at FAO are working extremely hard to produce the first draft before the end of this year. That will then be available for consultation with member states at the beginning of 2024, with the final draft expected for submission for consideration at the Committee on Agriculture in October 2024. Okay, so I'm now moving on to the second part of my presentation, looking at interventions that could improve the sustainability of plastics used in agriculture and safeguarding soils in India and elsewhere. The main principle is to take a holistic approach to assess the benefits and trade-offs and risks of products and their alternatives across the whole of their life cycle. The next step is to use the principles of the 6R approach. There are a number of these R's. There are 3R approach, 4R approach, but in our report, we use the 6R approach as a mechanisms to identify how interventions could work to improve the sustainability. And these are refuse, so avoid or ban unnecessary and particularly harmful products. Redesign, for example, to improve product circularity. Reduce the quantity of plastics used. Reuse, develop systems that can safely reuse products multiple times rather than single uses, as Aidan was talking about, and ensure that products are suitable for recycling at the end of life. And finally, last case, finally recover some value from the products. So what I would like to do is to use an example of mulching films of how this could potentially work. So here on the screen, you should see pictures of, or various images of mulching films throughout their working life. And this is non-biodegradable mulching films used in an open field setting, and looking at some of the problems. The films, the two left, so the two pictures you have on the left, the films look nice and neat when they're first laid, but if they don't have circular planting holes already cut in, it is left to the farmer to make those holes. So there's a danger that the offcuts will litter the field and the roughly cut holes will rip easily. Films are easily damaged during cultivation and retrieval, especially with the removal of plant residues and lifting from the soil, which you can see here. And you can see the darker spots where the films have been damaged and have leaked, the plastic has leaked into the field. When lifted, films typically are heavily contaminated with soil, plant residues, and moisture. Typically only about a third of the weight is plastic. This, and you can see that here in these bales of a recovered film. This contamination makes recycling impractical and uneconomic. And finally, if the film is left on the field too long or is used in an inappropriate crop, as in the case, in this case here, where it was used on asparagus cultivation, which was later abandoned, it becomes impossible to retrieve, and the subsequent farmer plowed it into the soil, and residues can be seen 5 years afterwards. And we know from examples in China where they used very thin mulching films after extended plastic use and incorporation in the soil, the capacity for the soil to produce plants is heavily reduced, and they found that their yields dropped significantly. So what are these sorts of interventions that could be used to avoid these sorts of problems? So for non-biodegradable mulching films, minimum thickness as part of a product standard is one thing that the European Union is looking towards, and they're setting a minimum thickness of 25 microns. And this means that the material at the end of its life is sufficiently durable and robust such that it can be removed intact without leaving materials in the soil. There should be bans on hazardous additives and polymers that are of particular concern, particularly at end of life, for example, like PVC, which is highly polluting if it's burnt. Limited duration of usage before retrieval, ensuring that the farmers, the films are not left beyond their useful life on the field and then become impossible to retrieve. And pre-perforated holes. Licensing systems and monitoring to ensure that the life cycle is managed competently and the people that are using it have the capacity. So that's licensing of suppliers, users, application and retrieval equipment to minimize soilage, for example. End-of-life management. Mandatory extended producer responsibility has proven to be an effective mechanism for the collection of and recycling of agricultural plastic waste at its end of life. And economics. The purchase price of these materials should include the cost of all extended externalities, including extended producer responsibility and residual liability for retrieval by suppliers. And finally, elimination of all subsidies to protect nature-based and knowledge labor-intensive alternatives. it's important that systems that are working effectively, particularly with small-scale farmers that rely on nature-based solutions such as biomass and cover crops, are not unfairly competing because of subsidized agricultural plastics. Biodegradable mulches have similar issues. So product standards, they need to meet the biodegradability performance standards for all the agroecological zones of use. Across India, moisture, temperatures, soil standards, or soil characteristics are all going to mean that biodegradable mulches are biodegrade at different rates. It's important that the products that are put on the market are able to provide an appropriate product that biodegrades at appropriate speed for that particular area. There should be ban on hazardous additives and oxo-degradable plastics, which just use chemical mechanisms to break down the plastics into microplastics, and they never fully biodegrade. Similarly, licensing mechanisms need to be put in place. And at any and finally, similarly, the economics. It's important that there are no subsidies and that nature-based and alternative solutions are adequately protected from unfair competition. Having said that, I know that one of the previous events you had, Luca Nizzetto presented about microplastic pollution in soil, and his team is working on the potential effects of and how there are some concerns that harm has been shown by microbiomes during the degradation process. Finally, just quickly looking at greenhouses. On the picture on the left, nice serried ranks of designed and maintained greenhouses. They need to be maintained, they need to be well constructed, need to be dismantled before the plastic reaches a point where it is destroyed. And as you can see on the bottom right, this is a case where a greenhouse has been left too long, the film are used far too long, and they should be removed before they stage. So similarly, these are some of the interventions that could be done. There need to be product standards, so standards for the films and the structures, their performance, a specific time that the films can be used before they have to be removed. There should be professional installation and maintenance. Similarly, there should be licensing and monitoring to ensure competence and compliance with all the actors in the supply chain. End of life, there should be mandatory extended producer responsibility to ensure that the films are collected and that the collected films are not inappropriately repurposed. There are examples where films are being used for roofing, used films are being used for roofing in shanty towns and that sort of thing. That use should be prevented. And finally, there should be economic mechanisms to ensure that the purchase price includes all the externalities, including EPR, and that there is a financial mechanism to fund the retrieval of abandoned greenhouses once the films reach their end of life. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope you found it interesting and look forward to the Q&A session afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That gave us much insight into formulating the FAO's important voluntary code of conduct on sustainable use of plastics in agriculture, and also helping us understand what are the possible interventions that could be put in place so that we can really address this issue. So now we move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Dharmesh, for taking out time. Our next speaker is Dharmesh Shah, uh, who is an Indian-based environmental policy analyst, researcher, and writer who has worked at the intersections of waste, air pollution, biodiversity, climate, and participatory governance. He is culturally engaged as a senior campaigner, consultant for the Plastic Treaty with the Center for International Environmental Law, also known as CIEL. Dharmesh coordinates the civil society and rights holder coalition of the Plastics Treaty negotiations at CIEL. Dharmesh, what are your thoughts, please, on the focus of plastics in agriculture in the Plastics Treaty, if at all there are any, and also CIL's role in formulating international laws on plastics, and also are there any that focus on plastics in agriculture? Over to you, Dharmesh.
Thank you, Monodeep. Can you share the slides if possible?
Yeah, I'll just share the slide. So allow me. And please give me a cue when I should really change
I'll do
the
that.
slide. Yeah.
Thank you. So, and I'm really glad I could join. I thought I would be late for this session, but I could join and listen to both Aidan and Dr. Richard for that overview. My expertise is certainly not agriculture and plastics. I look at the plastics treaty space and I look at specific issues. My background's in waste management. I've spent a lot of time understanding how waste flows to society. And this is certainly a very big issue that is not spoken about as much. And I'm glad we're having this conversation, and thanks to Earth Day for organizing this. I usually start talking about it. Next slide, please. Talking about environmental issues generally with this important slide on the triple planetary crisis. It's important to understand that all these various things we're talking about are interconnected. The climate and biodiversity and the pollution, which plastic pollution is a subset of environmental pollution overall. And these things are interconnected. And when we talk about one, we have to talk about the other, and we cannot be siloed in our approach. And I think this is becoming evident for a lot of the CSOs who are engaging in this space, and policymakers also, that we need to see the interconnections between these issues. Next slide, please. I won't dwell much into the sources of plastic in pollution from the agriculture sector, because Dr. Richard gave a very comprehensive overview. So I will not try to compete with that knowledge. But I just wanted to show this slide that, these are the various sources. And he did touch upon a few of them of plastic pollution from the agro sector. And we can see that it's a diversity of sources. We look at the overall use of plastic in agriculture, and this is old data, and he did share the new data from the FAO report. But I think it is a very, very substantial amount of plastic that is contributed by the agriculture sector. And all of this eventually ends up in the environment in one way or the other, unless right interventions are not taken. So in this particular specific area, I wanted to kind of quickly touch upon the issue of oxo-degradable plastics, because this does keep coming up in the plastics treaty space, because oxo-degradable plastics at this point are extremely problematic as an alternative, at least by folks who've been dealing with this or have been looking at plastic policy and plastic waste. And when you talk about alternatives to the current system or current polymers, we have to adhere to the principle of non-regrettable substitutes. And this is true for plastics, specifically oxo-degradable plastics. And what I understand is that the EU has banned their use, and China has a non-binding guidance for their use. So some parties are already looking at oxodegradables with some amount of caution when it comes to plastics in agriculture. And same goes with biodegradables, because there again, it's a big area of discussion in the plastic treaty space as an alternative, because biodegradable use of biodegradables is also a lot of concerns about where it's coming from. There's food security issues. If you're looking at bio-based sources coming from corn or other starch materials from plant-based plastics, then there's certainly a concern about food security and climate both, because you're looking at diversion of croplands for making plastics. In the next slide, please. So in terms of how, and this is a report that CIEL published earlier last year, and so in the Sowing a Plastic Planet, and this we specifically looked at agrochemicals and microplastics in agrochemicals, and this is a major area of concern. And again, within the context of the plastics treaty, this is not being addressed. And it's a subset of the plastic pollution caused by the agricultural sector. And Dr. Richard already spoke about the FAO report, which talks about the contribution of plastics, the plastic sector, amount of plastic that is used by that sector in plant and animal production. But the issue of microplastic pollution and the deliberate addition of this to synthetic fertilizers and pesticides in agriculture is less discussed. And I think this is a much larger problem when it comes to microplastic pollution, because what is being done by the agrochem industry is that there's a deliberate addition of microplastics and synthetic fertilizers. Fertilizers are coated with plastics, and seeds are being coated with plastics. And the argument that the industry has been using is that it's necessary for climate-friendly agriculture, which is what they're selling as controlled release pesticides and fertilizers, which slowly release into the environment, use less of that. But this is being sold as in the guise of climate-friendly agriculture. And this is a major concern. It needs to be addressed and challenged. In the EU alone, 10,000 tons of polymers are used in the slow and controlled release fertilizers. And I'm sure there's data for other countries also on the use of polymers in agriculture, pesticides and fertilizers. But as a result of this and all these various sources that Dr. Richard spoke about, and what I showed in the first slide, it's estimated that about the soil, the terrestrial soils have 23 times greater plastic pollution than marine environments. So it is certainly a big concern when it comes to human health, which I'll come to a bit later, and also in terms of how eventually it all ends up washes off into our rivers and water bodies and ultimately the ocean. So it is a major crisis and needs to be addressed in a very concerted and substantial way. The last thing I want to just bring in this particular issue is that in India or a lot of countries, there's there are policies that encourage the use of sewage sludge as fertilizer. And sewage sludge, again, is a major source of microplastic pollution. And if you are applying this to agricultural fields as soil enhancers, then you are immediately shooting up the concentration of microplastics in agricultural soils. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the definition of plastic, this is where we come to the substance of the plastics treaty discussions. And there is no common agreement on how plastics are defined. You know, experts have been grappling with this since the materials invented in the 1950s, you know, and this has been at the heart of the plastic crisis. We have no idea what goes into the plastics or how to deal with it. And as policymakers, this is the biggest challenge. Our municipal systems are designed to tackle food, paper, glass, or metal. There's no economically viable post-consumer recovery system for most plastic types. And that goes also for agricultural post-use agricultural plastics, including the mulch sheets and all those things. Like, we can have targeted policies, but do we have economic systems in place that will actually make it economically viable for use of reuse or recycling of these plastics? And we know that in the post-consumer plastic sector, it's not true. It's been a major problem to find viable market solutions to actually recycle, quote unquote, plastics in the true sense of the word. So globally, this is a global problem, not just an Asian problem. It's also the global North countries that are facing huge problems when it comes to dealing with plastics. So the next, how do we define pollution? The plastic treaty is grappling with this, like I said. And ultimately, where does the pollution begin? So that brings me to my next slide, which should. Sorry, before that, I just like to talk about how there are this confusion even within MEAs on how to define plastics. There are 3 different legally binding definitions of plastics. And if you look at ultimately, like, the Harmonized System Convention, MARPOL, and the Regional Plan on Marine Litter, all have defined plastics in a different way. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, there is a definition, the European Committee for Standardization of 2006, which says that the term plastic or plastics do not have a precise meaning because they reflect rather complex formulated system whose exact composition is generally unknown. And this is our biggest problem when it comes to policy making, because we do not know what plastics are. We have absolutely no idea what goes into plastics, because a lot of these things, and when I say what goes in plastic, not just polymers, there's a lot of chemicals that are added to the plastics, most of which are unknown, and it's in industry. There's no transparency around how these chemicals are used or added to plastics. Next slide, please. So what is plastic pollution? And this is where it gets a bit complicated. And this is, again, something that is an area of debate in the plastics treaty negotiations. Like, where does plastic pollution begin exactly? And this could be kind of traced back. The whole treaty discussion could be traced back to 2019. In 2019, when UNEP made an analysis, which was mandated by the United Nations Environment Assembly to assess the legal gaps in addressing marine litter and microplastics, which showed that how this is a global problem and that needs global solutions. And then that there was no convention that is encompassing the full life cycle of plastic pollution. Now, plastics was generally being seen by all the by governments and by UN bodies as an end of life issue, where you just manage it at the end of its life. But that wasn't working. So a life cycle approach was for the first time, recommended, and which is what you see reflected in the UNIA Resolution 514 that came up later, where the life cycle approach has been embedded within the text of the resolution. So we as CIEL have been strong advocates of a plastic treaty across a full life cycle. So we keep fighting for a treaty that will address plastic from production to use to consumption and disposal, and not just disposal. And next slide, please. So that, as I mentioned, the UNIA Resolution 514 that eventually came out of this process has the mention of full life cycle and plastic pollution in all environments, including microplastics, and a comprehensive approach. So it's not just end of life waste management interventions. So this was a major victory, and this is the foundation for the discussions that we're having right now, the zero draft that came out that Aidan was talking about. And this is the spirit of the treaty. This should be the spirit of whatever legal instrument comes out of this process in the future. Next slide, please. So we have also analyzed the zero draft, and this is the zero draft. This is what formed the basis of the discussions at INC 3, which ended recently in Nairobi. and it will continue being, and based on this, a first draft will be released in December 31st, which will form the basis of discussions at INC4 in Canada in April next year. And CIEL has, and a lot of other organizations have also developed detailed analysis, and we have developed an annotated version of the zero draft, seeing what are the major gaps in the way zero draft had been developed. The zero draft does not specifically mention agricultural sector. There's a provision on fishing gear and use of plastics in fishing gear. But FAO has been making submissions to the process, and they have made submissions before the INC3 happened. They've made 2 submissions, very important, substantial submissions that went to the INC3 for use of plastics in agriculture and fishing both. And CIEL has also been engaging with the FAO and has sent submissions to the Voluntary Code of Conduct process, which Dr. Richard was talking about. So we see this as an important space. We need more voices here. We need more stronger voices in this, because I agree that we need a sectoral approach, and agriculture, the sectoral approach in agriculture, and agricultural sector has to be an important part of the discussion in the plastics treaty. It's crucial in this space also for right holders and to meaningfully participate in lawmaking processes, and that's one of the endeavors of the coalition that we coordinate. That the participation of civil society is important in whatever happens, whatever outcomes that come out of this INC process, and ultimately the final text of the legally binding instrument. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. Oh, sorry, the health impacts. And this is important. Health impacts, and this is something that CIEL has worked on, and we have several reports on this. One important report, which I'll talk about later, is on the health impacts of plastics. And it's important to notice that I mentioned that health impacts happen at every stage of the life cycle of plastics, and which is why we keep emphasizing the need for a life cycle approach, because if you're looking at human health and animal health impact, it's not just about the physical impacts of plastics. We need to distinguish the physical impacts of plastics and microplastics from the thousands of chemicals that are used in plastics, and which is a much or equally larger concern when it comes to plastic pollution. Some of these chemicals, most of this, we have no idea what they do to human body and animal life. So a full life cycle approach will also have to integrate health impacts across the life cycle. Next slide, please. And just to drive that point of chemicals across, like I said, there are thousands of chemicals, and a lot of these plastics, they absorb these chemicals and accumulate these toxins. And some of these are persistent organic pollutants that are used, and especially in the context of agriculture. We know a lot of chemicals that are used in agriculture are POPs, and these bioaccumulate. They do not degrade. They are forever chemicals. A lot of them are forever chemicals, and plastics become the perfect vehicle to carry them into human bodies and into animal bodies. So we know that these cause irreparable harm and to the health and environment both. So some of these chemicals, like you're looking at more than 13,000 chemicals, substances used in plastics, and only a quarter of we don't have, and more than a quarter of them are known as substances of concern. So that means they have known impact on human health and animal health. And there are major regulatory gaps and research gaps on how these chemicals impact human health. We just know that they do. And we have no information at all on what synergistic impact they cause, like when these chemicals interact with each other, how they impact our bodies. So this is a major area of research. We need more pressure on companies and governments on transparency on chemicals and use of chemicals in plastics. Last slide, please. these are just some of the reports that I was talking about. And this is, we have been participating in the sessions, the INC sessions, the UNIA, since the plastic issue was first framed as a marine litter and a microplastic issue. And as I said, part of our advocacy has been to show the impacts of the full life cycles of plastic, exposing the connections with climate and health. And like I said earlier, triple planetary crisis, and these are interconnected issues. So we see them as interconnected issues. And I think a lot of our work has been to expose those, the nexus between these issues. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dharmesh. It's truly amazing to know about CIEL's role in framing plastic policies, and it's genuinely commendable the work that CIEL is doing. So it's now time to take up a few questions. So we have a few questions that are there. So I'll just merge the two questions that Rodolfo has placed. The first one being, what is the importance for environment and food security of rain-fed agriculture, as most countries in global south? This is the first part, and this is probably directed to you, Richard. Regarding initial comment on Richard Thompson on cleaning containers, I agree. Also, please comment on the actions for the ballast water of maritime ships. This is transported around the world, and the danger of migration once replaced of invasive species around the world is also a point to be considered at INC 3. So these are the points that have been mentioned. So anyone would like to take this up? Richard?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Let
please go.
me take Rodolfo's point about the importance of plastic and the environment and food security in rain-fed agriculture in most countries in the global south. Well, I think it's true that plastic is being used in the global south, but the story is different between different continents. In fact, on Monday, the International Knowledge Hub Against Plastic Pollution is having a webinar which is actually going to address plastic issues in soils in Africa and Latin America. And there are a number of speakers, one of whom comes from the International Research Center for Maize in Zimbabwe. And there, the situation is that actually nature-based solutions are being used. So smallholder farmers, which is the majority of the farming practices in that area, use knowledge and things like cover crops, biomass materials for mulching, agroforestry, intercropping. They use all these knowledge-intensive mechanisms and are actually not using plastics, and they're able to adapt to climate change using these particular techniques. So in this case, it's important that those techniques are continually allowed to thrive, and as far as possible are promoted for being used in other regions. And that was my point about ensuring that subsidies for cheap plastic mulching films do not drive these practices into the ground. It's important that these practices survive and are promoted. I think in Latin America, where there are many more large-scale farms, the use of plastics is much more widespread. And that's why it's important that there are very effective mechanisms to minimize the damage that those products could have throughout their life cycle. and the scheme that Brazil, for example, has established. It was one of the first schemes, I think, in the early 2000s, established to collect empty pesticide containers and ensure that they could be recycled. That is an effective scheme and could be expanded to other plastic materials used in the country. I hope that answers that question.
Rodolfo, does that answer your question? Do you have anything else to ask? I see your hand raised.
Yes. No, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. No, thank you, Dr. Thompson, for your kind comments. Yes, it's very important what you have said about, the need of nature-based solutions, especially with the life cycle approach, because the life cycle approach was on native, knowledge. So that's why I was asking that. And also I made a question on the ballast of, maritime transport. Many are not aware that the plastic microplastic travels only in containers. Microplastic in the ships, in merchant ships, because they have ballast that need to replace in every port. And this ballast not only has microplastics, but also has, endangered species that they provide a free transport all around the world. That was my last question. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the DIP, and also Aidan that is here. He's our delegate, all permanent delegate in IC3. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. I guess there are no other questions. So I'll just like to throw up a couple of more questions since we have a little time. So one of the questions that I would like to ask is that we have been talking about extended producer responsibility. So based on that, there are some European countries that have a national collecting scheme. So if someone can maybe elaborate on this, and also are these actually helping in reducing the use of plastics in agriculture? Anyone would like to take it up?
I'm very happy to take it up. I don't want to monopolize the question and answer
session. Please go ahead. We can always ask others as well. Yeah.
Okay. I think with regard to extended producer responsibility, first of all, it's important to say that there are no hard and fast rules that apply to every single circumstance. So I think countries need to investigate how that their products are being used, where they're being used, who uses them, how often they become waste, and develop schemes accordingly. However, I think there are some principles that apply to agriculture. Plastics used in agriculture are specific, that they're used by farmers. They're used in large quantities, very often in places that are far from infrastructure. And so it's important that whatever schemes are developed, they are focused on the needs of the farmers. It's important that the barriers for farmers to do the right thing when a plastic product reaches the end of its life, those barriers need to be minimized. If there's any barrier at all, the chances are that it's going to encourage mismanagement, burning of plastics with consequence of wider scale pollution, health effects, air quality dropping, all that sort of thing. So it's important that the schemes are convenient. So there's one I'd like to mention, which is in France. It's called Adivalor. It started in 2000 with being just a collection scheme for empty pesticide containers for farmers. It then moved on to taking unwanted pesticide waste, so residues of pesticides that weren't used within their time. Those were collected too, and gradually the scheme developed to add on more and more wastes that were generated on farms. And so it started with mulching films, with greenhouse films, with fertilizer sacks, with protection nets, bale, twine, plant support twine, those sorts of things. Gradually, they added more and more products to their scheme. It works by the trade associations for each of those products contributing an eco fee to the scheme, and that fund is used to support the collection and the recycling of the waste that are collected. It relies on reverse distribution, so that the distributors maintain a location where farmers can bring their wastes when they come to the shop to buy more materials. They can bring their waste at the same time, and then that waste is segregated and goes into the supply chain, the recycling chain. Now, so this doesn't actually reduce the amount of plastics being used in agriculture. What it does do is means that plastic that is used has an opportunity to be managed properly, not become waste, and not be mismanaged on the farm. So once again, it's called Adivalor. I will paste the name in the chat, and it has a website that's available both in French and in English.
Yeah, that would be great. I see someone else has also raised his hand. So if the speakers are fine with it, we are just overflowing by a couple of minutes. If all of you are okay, I'll just take this question too. Yeah, Shamala. Yes.
Shamala, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for letting me ask this question. Well, basically, in India, like Dharmesh explained, we do have a lot of collection systems. Now, in fact, plastic collection by certain NGOs and, CSR-based organizations is happening. But the question is, it is all going for the so-called recycling, where extremely poor quality stuff is being made. And, and in fact, irrigation pipes are also being made from seconds, especially the high density and low density polyethylene. And sometimes the PVC pipes as well. And of course, as everybody knows, there are lots of additives. And, in the recycling units, they add a lot of calcium carbonate when it has to be hard plastic, when they want to harden the PVC pipes, which are very often used as irrigation pipes, or sometimes soften it with chlorinated paraffin wax and phthalates. And finally, because of their poor quality, they may go to, again, to be used in agriculture, but they end up as microplastics as well. So when we say EPR, and when we say collection is important, but what is the use? It is going for making extremely poor quality recycled products, which are going to end up as microplastics, even at a faster rate than even the regular ones. So, I mean, what is this EPR all about? I can't understand. And also the hazardous, the pesticide containers, we took the granules and we tested it at IITR in Lucknow. And we found that even the granules, recycled granules, had the pesticide hydrocarbon. We were able to detect it. So anything made from that would leach into water at neutral pH and room temperature. So how are we protecting ourselves? So these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamala. I see Dharmesh. Would you like to take it up, Dharmesh?
Yes, thank you for raising that important point, Dr. Shamla, because I think that is why the first two obligations in Plastics Treaty are dealing with that. And this is something that Aidan raised in his initial comments, is while we take a sectoral approach for agriculture or other sectors for that matter, production reduction is the main thing. And the main aim of the Plastics Treaty negotiations, or whatever instrument that comes out of the negotiations, should be caps on production. And there is no way out of that. We have tools like EPR, we have several different policy interventions. Now we're talking a lot about plastic credits, but none of these things are going to actually solve the problem in the long run, because we're just making too much plastic. And we have to come together in a concerted way to talk about production reduction. And we hope that parties that are negotiating this treaty agree on obligation one, which is plastic production reduction and primary plastic polymers. The second thing is chemicals of concern. Now, every time we talk about circular economy, there's a lot of discussion happening on circular economy. There's a lot of money going into that in policy space and circular economy. But if we do not remove toxins from plastics, we're just going to have a poisoned circular economy, and which is again not a thing that we want to see in the future, because if we keep recycling the same toxins into the economy, we're going to have a very, very problematic toxic circulation of toxics in the economy. And that is a major problem when it comes to human health, and which is true because a lot of these substances, when you recycle them, they concentrate and they concentrate into the recyclate. And what we have in the end is a lot more concentrated toxins in the final recycled products. So it is something that we need to talk about. And of course, another thing that the treaty is talking about, we'll try to achieve, is elimination of problematic plastics, which includes things like PVC. This is the most poisonous plastic known to mankind. It has no reason to be used for any purpose. So I think some speakers, including Dr. Richards, mentioned that in his talk, that PVC is a major concern when it comes to agricultural pipes as well, because no matter what you do with PVC, it harms human health and environment. You can't burn it, you can't bury it, you can't recycle it. It's just problematic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dharmesh. So we have come to the end of the webinar. I'll just like to take this opportunity to thank all of you. We have really identified quite a few important concerns, like we did talk about how it is important to really address the production part. We have to reduce production. We have to understand that plastic has to be addressed in its entirety, in the entire life cycle, and how it is important as we address the EPR as well. So, and as well as the additives that go into plastics in several things. So thank you so much. I'll just take this opportunity again to thank everyone, and I'll just write to each one of you to maybe come up with some of the points, concrete points, which you feel, I'm talking about the speakers, which you feel should form a part of whatever are being framed in terms of policies, and when it comes to plastics in agriculture. And we could then maybe frame a document which could then become a submission to wherever we plan to do that. So thank you once again, and it has been a really insightful webinar. And with Earth Day coming up and the theme being planet versus plastics, each one of your role is so very important. So we hope to catch you again in some other webinar or in some other panel. I'll just thank everyone and close this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye.